You have no idea how anything works, do you? Musk snapped without raising his voice, eyes locked with a cold precision on the trembling figure of Senator Malcolm Hargrove, whose face flushed under the pressure of 1,000 eyes, journalists, fingers hovering over keyboards, cameras quietly humming as if hungry for collapse. The room hadn't breathed in 7 seconds. This wasn't a press conference anymore. This was a slow-motion collision of ego and evidence, and the one holding both was standing in a black shirt and unbothered demeanor, the ghost of a smirk dancing on his lips like he'd already won before stepping in. Hargrove, chest-puffed, in an outdated display of authority, had just finished a condescending tirade about regulation and corporate responsibility, clearly underestimating how many facts Musk had stored and sharpened like blades. The insult, simple and surgically delivered, gutted the senator's 5-minute speech with the same force as a mic drop in a courtroom. Musk didn't blink. He didn't have to. Every syllable landed with a weight that rewrote the balance of power in the room. The air snapped like static. No shouting, no raised fists, no dramatic gestures, just data, confidence, and the brutal efficiency of a man who had memorized not only his opponent's flaws, but the system they hid behind. There was no comeback. The sentence wasn't designed for debate. It was a full stop, the kind you didn't see coming until it slammed the brakes on everything you thought you knew. The silence afterward was so dense it felt like the walls might collapse from the pressure. Even the senator's aides, once cocky in their polished shoes and bullet-pointed talking notes, stared blankly as if the floor had fallen out beneath them. The moment had started as a polite hearing on AI regulation, with Hargrove trying to score political points by grilling Musk on ethics, control, and playing God with machines. But it ended with one sentence that reduced years of political theater to a single exposed nerve. Elon's voice was calm, disturbingly calm, and that calmness was the weapon. No theatrics, no trembling hands, just a man whose mind outpaced the room before most people finished their coffee. There was no raise in tone, but the devastation was nuclear. Everyone knew it. Journalists who had prepared balanced coverage now had a front-page headline, and it was bleeding truth. The senator opened his mouth as if to reply, but nothing came. Not a word. Not a sound. Because deep inside, in that buried part of the human psyche where pride and doubt meet, he knew it wasn't just a rhetorical checkmate. It was a mirror, and what he saw in it wasn't a leader, but a man completely, terrifyingly out of his depth. A chair creaked somewhere in the chamber, loud as thunder in the fragile hush that followed. The sentence hadn't just cut. It had shifted something tectonic beneath the marble floors of the Capitol hearing room, a change so profound it didn't scream. It simply was, irreversible and absolute. Senator Hargrove's jaw clenched, not out of determination, but instinct, like a soldier gripping a useless shield after the war has already been lost. His hands twitched as if reaching for prepared notes, legal jargon, bulletproof sound bites designed to neutralize Silicon Valley arrogance. But even he knew in that moment that paper was powerless against the precision of reality. It wasn't about who had spoken more words or who had memorized more policy. It was about who had spoken the right words at the perfect time, and that battle had ended before most people in the room even understood it had started. Musk didn't move. Still seated, fingers loosely woven in his lap, he radiated something far more unsettling than defiance. He radiated certainty. Not the brash kind that politicians wear like cheap suits during election season, but the quiet, earned kind, the kind forged in rocket crashes, sleepless nights, and trillion-dollar gambles that actually paid off. He had built empires where others had held committee meetings. He had rewritten industries while bureaucrats debated their existence. And now he was sitting across from a man who had never created anything except fear and delay, and he had just dismantled that man's entire persona with a dozen words. Across the panel, the other senators glanced sideways, nervous. Some leaned away from Hargrove as if his political decay was contagious. They were calculating, always calculating, not what the truth was, but how close they could afford to stand to it without catching fire. The aides, once busily tapping, away at their tablets, were frozen, uncertain whether to keep typing or pretend they hadn't heard. But they had. Everyone had. The phrase echoed not like a quote, but like an indictment, whispered now under the breaths of interns, staffers, and reporters who had shown up expecting routine spectacle and instead witnessed something raw and rare: accountability. Outside the building, the story was already mutating into legend. Screens lit up with hastily typed headlines, clips spreading like wildfire through social media, each replay of that one sentence feeding the global bonfire of collective disbelief. There was no spin that could clean this up, no PR statement agile enough to dance around the force of the moment. Musk hadn't insulted the senator, he had revealed him. He had turned the spotlight into an X-ray, showing not just incompetence, but the arrogance of ignorance, and he had done it without a single wasted word. And in that stillness, as the audience waited for someone, anyone, to speak, Hargrove leaned forward, mouth dry, eyes darting in search of some anchor. But none was left. His voice finally cracked through the silence, trying to recover footing with a limp. "Mr. Musk, with all due respect." But respect had already exited the room, and it wasn't coming back. Elon tilted his head slightly, the way a scientist observes a failed experiment before moving on. There was no anger in his eyes. There was no satisfaction either. There was only clarity, the clarity of a man who had once slept on the floor of his factory because he refused to pretend, and who now sat face to face with a man who had spent his life doing exactly that. And then, almost imperceptibly, Musk leaned back, his posture casual, but his presence as heavy as a meteor. He didn't need to say another word because one had already done what speeches never could. He had held up a mirror and dared the system to look. And it had. And what it saw was unforgivable. The senator's voice faltered mid-sentence like a car sputtering on its last fumes, a clumsy stammer of deflection laced with desperation, the kind that turns even confident liars into trembling shadows of themselves. "With all due respect," he'd started. But the weight of those words had been crushed under the one Musk had already spoken. "You have no idea how anything works, do you?" It echoed still, like a phantom bell tolling judgment, its resonance louder in silence than anything that came after it. People weren't listening to Hargrove anymore. They were studying his unraveling, the twitch beneath his left eye, the sudden paleness creeping into his cheeks, the subtle way he shifted in his chair as if trying to shrink from a spotlight that had long since burned through the surface. Musk remained silent. That silence, however, was not absence. It was dominance. The kind that comes not from bluster or shouting, but from the terrifying stillness of someone who knows they don't need to defend themselves because the truth is doing it for them. Cameras zoomed in, lenses thirsting for the micro-expressions that would decorate tomorrow's thumbnails. Musk didn't flinch. His body language didn't waver. His expression remained unreadable, serene, but sharp-edged, like glass just before it shatters. The world outside the room was no longer just watching. They were studying him, devouring the footage in real time, dissecting every nuance for signs of superiority, vindication, or blood. Senator Hargrove's eyes darted around the panel, looking for allies. None came. His supporters sat like statues, their carefully coordinated nods and smiles turned brittle, now terrified to be associated with a man whose credibility had just imploded in public. Behind him, an aide coughed into their fist, but the sound was fake, a desperate attempt to break the unbearable weight of exposure. You could feel the room tightening, not just against Hargrove, but around the very concept of politics as performance. The curtain hadn't just been pulled back, it had been ripped off, and in its place was the cold, brutal truth. A man who had built rockets that worked, cars that didn't need gas, satellites that outlived entire legislative terms, was telling the system that its emperor had no clothes, and the system was listening. Musk finally shifted. Not dramatically, just enough to reach for his water. The casual motion was thunderous. It told the room and everyone watching online that he was done speaking because nothing else needed to be said. He sipped slowly, like a man not just unbothered by conflict but nourished by it. A half smile ghosted over his lips. Not gloating, not cruel, just knowing. The kind of smile someone wears when they've predicted every move 15 steps ahead and just witnessed their opponent Step into the trap exactly as expected. And then the whispers began. Not from the public, but from within the political core itself. Staffers leaned toward each other with hushed panic. A senator to Hargrove's right subtly slid his chair an inch away. Notes were being scribbled, texts were being sent under the desk, damage control plans were already failing before they were written. There was no spinning this, no reframing it. Elon's sentence had crossed the threshold between media moment and cultural shift. It had violated the unspoken rule of political theater. Never call the bluff so plainly that the illusion can't recover. Hargrove cleared his throat, tried again. "You're out of touch with the average American," he said, voice louder this time, artificial, trembling with the weight of pre-written indignation. But it didn't land. It couldn't. Because everyone knew the difference between a man who pretended to care and a man who built the machines carrying humanity into the future. Musk didn't even respond. That was the deeper wound. Hargrove had become irrelevant in real time. There was no rebuttal anymore, only echoes in a space that no longer belonged to him. And then came the ripple, the kind that turns moments into movements. Posts exploded online, headlines screamed the phrase, reaction videos multiplied by the second, each dissecting the sentence like scripture. Analysts began to call it the new, "You're no Jack Kennedy" moment, but deeper, sharper, more lethal. Because it wasn't nostalgia or historical resonance, it was now raw and undistilled. Musk had peeled away not just the mask of one man, but the entire facade of a broken institution, using a single sentence that could not be dismissed as disrespect because it was true. And truth, when stripped of apology, has a sound that leaves ruins in its wake. The moment didn't fade. It calcified, hardened into something timeless before it had even finished unfolding. Senator Hargrove tried to recover with rehearsed aggression, his voice rising an octave, the syllables sharper, trying to summon moral authority from somewhere in the ruins of his pride. "You think being rich makes you right?" he said, gesturing, broadly as if the size of his motions could distract from the emptiness of their content. "You think because you built a few toys for billionaires, you're above accountability?" But it came off like a tantrum disguised as a thesis, a soundbite frantically stitched together from shredded cue cards, spoken not to win but to survive. The words hung in the air, but they didn't stick. They collapsed under their own weight, like scaffolding built too fast on hollow ground. Musk didn't answer. He didn't need to. The earlier sentence still vibrated in every corner of the chamber like a frequency only truth can reach. "You have no idea how anything works, do you?" The insult hadn't been flamboyant or vulgar. It had been clinical, the linguistic equivalent of a scalpel sliding between joints, separating pretense from substance with no blood, just silence. That's what made it so lethal. Because deep down, every person in that room, regardless of party or loyalty, understood the weight of that sentence. Not just as an attack on a man, but as an indictment of a system that produced men like him, and called it leadership. Now it was too late. The crowd had tasted authenticity, and the taste was addictive. Musk sat composed, motionless, but impossibly present, like a monument to audacity, while the senator flailed against the rising tide of his own obsolescence. For a moment, the world felt split in two. Those who were still clinging to the old game, and those watching it die in real time, watching it be replaced by something uncomfortably honest and infinitely more dangerous. Competence that didn't ask for permission. Even reporters who had arrived with sharpened knives turned their pens inward, scribbling new angles, new truths. Musk hadn't argued policy, he had annihilated illusion. He hadn't come to debate, he had come to expose. And the exposure was spreading like a wildfire in a paper town. Newsrooms were already drafting op-eds with phrases like watershed, moment, collapse of political theater, the sentence that changed everything. It wasn't hyperbole. It was historical gravity, the kind that bends everything around it, the kind that rewrites the tone of every meeting, every debate, every campaign that comes after. Tone of every meeting, every debate, every campaign that comes after. Senator Hargrove's voice was cracking now, strained with the weight of his own unraveling. This kind of arrogance is why the public doesn't trust tech elites. He spat, eyes glinting with false righteousness, but there was a tremor underneath, a falter, the human instinct to flee disguised as indignation. And Musk, still unmoved, slowly turned his gaze to him again. Not aggressive, not angry, just accurate. A gaze that didn't see a senator or an opponent, but a symptom of inefficiency, of fear, of fossilized systems trying to wrap themselves around the future and failing to hold it still. Someone in the gallery laughed, softly, involuntarily, like a gasp. But it broke the final illusion that decorum still held this moment together. Laughter, in this sacred hall, was the ultimate betrayal of politics. It wasn't disrespect toward a man, but recognition of the absurdity that had just been exposed. That laugh rippled, others stifling chuckles, eyes wide with disbelief, and Hargrove looked around with frantic confusion, realizing not only had he lost control, but he no longer understood the rules of the game he thought he mastered. And then Musk spoke again, not with the same scalpel as before, but with something colder, something final. "You regulate what you don't understand because it scares you," he said quietly, voice flat as concrete. "But you can't legislate progress, out of fear. You can only slow it down long enough to be left behind." It wasn't a flourish. It wasn't even meant to sting. It was a eulogy, spoken not for applause, but because it was the kind of truth that needed to be said out loud before history buried it in sanitized transcripts. And once again, no one clapped, because no one could, because applause would have shattered the reverence of what had just been witnessed. It wasn't a clash. It wasn't a debate. It was an extinction event. The silence that followed Musk's final words was not peace. It was aftermath. It was the eerie, ringing stillness that follows an explosion, the kind where even breathing feels like betrayal because something sacred or profane has just occurred. Hargrove sat stiff, like a man embalmed in public shame, his eyes glazed, over in a 1,000-yard stare, as if searching some inner memory for a time when he still believed he had control. There was no rescue coming, no clever pivot, no staffer with a whisper of strategy in his ear. The performance was over, and all that remained was the raw carcass of truth laid bare in a room built to hide it. Musk didn't glance around to gauge the effect. He didn't need validation. He never did. His truths weren't up for votes. He knew what he had done, not just to a man, but to an institution that had mistaken ceremony for substance for far too long. His body language remained unchanged, relaxed, unreadable, but every person in the room could feel it. He had just walked through a wall no one else even dared touch. They had expected arrogance. They had expected deflection, combativeness, maybe even a tantrum. What they got was ice cold. Precision wrapped in casual indifference. It wasn't emotional. It was mechanical. It was devastating. A woman from the press pool near the back blinked, visibly shaken, and slowly began typing on her laptop again. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the electric weight of knowing she was writing about something people would quote for years, maybe decades. "You regulate what you don't understand because it scares you." The sentence was already reverberating through headlines, memes, academic articles yet unwritten. Political analysts on live television were stammering, struggling to keep up with the speed at which this moment had rewritten the script. Some tried to couch it in familiar terms, verbal sparring, clash of ideologies, but those words were not enough. Something older and deeper had happened. Musk had stood in a den of lions and reminded them that lions don't build cages. Hargrove finally exhaled. A short, sharp breath, like he'd been underwater and didn't realize. He opened his mouth again, this time not with anger or indignation, but something worse, uncertainty. That's not how democracy works," he mumbled, his voice paper-thin, but the damage was already past the point of repair. Even as the words left his lips, they sounded like a confession, an admission of irrelevance. Musk tilted his head slightly, the way a chess master might when watching his opponent reach for a rook too late, too desperate. The kind of look that said, "You're not wrong, but you're too slow for this timeline." Behind the panel, a younger senator shifted in his chair, wide-eyed, visibly processing not just the collapse of Hargrove's performance, but what it meant for everyone else who thought the rules of yesterday still applied. He wasn't alone. Throughout the chamber, younger staffers and aides, those who'd grown up on live streams, watched SpaceX land rockets on floating drones, typed out their childhood dreams under the soft glow of Tesla screens, were watching their generation be spoken for with a fluency they'd never seen from politics. And it wasn't coming from a president, or a senator, or a diplomat. It was coming from a man who broke the rules and built new ones in the wreckage. That was the real threat, and everyone in power knew it. Musk wasn't interested in winning arguments. He was interested in winning reality. And reality had just shifted to his side. Somewhere in the back of the room, a reporter's phone buzzed with the alert. The clip had hit 30 million views in under an hour. Hashtags exploded with furious momentum. Musk vs. Hargrove. You have no idea. One sentence KO. Each one a digital gravestone planted in Hargrove's once comfortable career. Public figures were already choosing sides, their PR teams scrambling to craft positions that didn't make them look archaic or cowardly. But the truth was, no one wanted to be Hargrove right now. No one wanted to be caught standing on the wrong side of inevitability. And still, Elon said nothing more. He just watched as the system he'd just gutted tried to dress itself, back up in protocol and dignity, as if anyone still believed in its costume. You could feel the power shift not just in the room, but in the architecture of influence itself. The old gods of policy and procedure were trembling before something faster, smarter, and utterly unimpressed by tradition. Hargrove turned slowly to his aides, lips parted, unsure of what to say, how to end, how to leave a room where his authority had just evaporated like mist under a floodlight. No one met his gaze, not even the ones paid to. That was the final fracture. Not the humiliation itself, but the loneliness it revealed. He stood awkwardly, stiff-backed, as if by sheer posture he could reassemble the man he'd been at the start of the hearing. But that man was gone. That man had been shattered by one sentence and buried by another. And Elon Musk, still sitting, still calm, still absolute. A single sentence had rewritten the dynamic not just between two men, but between power and progress. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't ask permission to speak. It simply spoke, and dared the world to keep up. The hearing never really resumed. It pretended to. Gears turned, cameras panned, a moderator cleared his throat and shifted into procedural autopilot, reciting the next item on the agenda as if the air hadn't been carved open just minutes before. But the energy had vanished. What had once been a carefully choreographed performance of authority now limped along like theater after the audience has already walked out. Musk leaned back slightly in his chair, not triumphant, not smug, just finished. He had delivered what he came to say, and the echo of that delivery would outlast anything else said that day, or perhaps any day that year. Senator Hargrove had returned to his seat but hadn't reclaimed it. His shoulders were lower, his hands clenched and unclenched without purpose, and his gaze never met Musk's again. It was the posture of a man still hearing that sentence replay, not once, but on loop. You have no idea how anything works, do you? It had bypassed his ears and rooted itself in the hollow beneath his ribcage. It had found a home in that vulnerable space where imposter syndrome lives, where doubt festers, beneath the marble and microphones. And now it throbbed, not because it was cruel, but because it had been right. Outside, the world had already moved. The internet was now a wildfire of resonance. Not just outrage, not just support, recognition. Thousands, then millions of comments. Flooded in, not with emojis or vague applause, but with detailed, deeply felt responses. Engineers, teachers, entrepreneurs, students, scientists, dreamers, people who had spent their lives running into walls built by those like Hargrove, shared their stories. I've been told I didn't know what I was doing by someone who'd never tried. This is every meeting I've ever had with a boss who couldn't code. Finally, someone said it out loud. It wasn't fandom, it was identification. Musk hadn't just crushed a man, He had given a voice to something global, buried under decades of red tape and rolled eyes, and inside the chamber, in that government sanctum lined with flags and stone and history, no one could look at him the same way again. Not the senators, not the aides, not the lobbyists pretending to jot down notes while texting panicked updates, because they had felt it too. The shift, the collapse of the wall between influence and actual competence. Elon Musk had not asked to be admired, and yet he had become something more dangerous than a symbol. He had become a mirror, and not everyone was ready to see what they looked like in its reflection. Musk stood, slowly. He didn't look rushed, didn't acknowledge the chaos he'd left in his wake, didn't glance back at the man he'd broken or the institution that now reeled around him. He simply gathered the few papers he'd brought, notes he never even used, and buttoned his jacket. A staffer stepped forward hesitantly, almost reverently, to guide him out. He didn't need the escort. He never did. The cameras clicked again as he exited, not as a guest, but as a storm leaving a city. The sound of his footsteps on the polished floor echoed louder than the applause that would never come. And back in his seat, Hargrove didn't move. Couldn't. Because what do you do when someone walks into your stronghold, tears out its foundation, and leaves you sitting in the rubble, with nothing but your title and your silence? The sentence still rang in his ears, not just as a personal defeat, but as a diagnosis. A moment that stripped away the illusion that authority meant knowledge, that power implied understanding. Elon hadn't insulted him. He had exposed him. And the worst part, the part Hargrove would carry long after the headlines faded, was that Elon had only needed one sentence to do it. By the time Musk stepped outside, the sky had turned a metallic shade of late afternoon. Reporters surged. Toward him, microphones outstretched, flashes blinding, but he waved them off with a polite smile, the kind that said, "I've already said enough." He slid into the back seat of a sleek, waiting Tesla, and as the door closed with that smooth, airtight sound, the world outside felt just a little different. He didn't look back. Why would he? Behind him, a system stood hollowed, and ahead of him, the future was waiting. Not in the halls of policy, but in launch pads, design labs, and neural code. And somewhere in that silence, as the car glided away and history adjusted its course, the sentence still lived, carved not into stone, but into the minds of millions. Undeniable, unerasable. You have no idea how anything works, do you? And nothing after that ever sounded the same again.